Picture yourself stepping into the nave of Chartres Cathedral, your eyes drawn upward to that magnificent rose window, its delicate tracery of stone and colored light forming a pattern so precise it feels almost supernatural. Every line, every curve, every proportion seems to whisper a secret language of the cosmos, a silent symphony written not in notes but in geometry. This is more than just architecture, it's alchemy. A transformation of stone, light, and belief into something transcendent. These spaces weren't merely built, they were composed, using a hidden mathematical order that medieval thinkers believed mirrored the mind of God. And what's truly astonishing is that this sacred geometry didn't just shape buildings, it shaped society itself, reinforcing ideals of harmony, order, and divine purpose in the hearts and minds of everyone who walked these halls. In this video, we're going to unravel one of history's most fascinating mysteries, how numbers, ratios, and shapes became the silent architects of an entire era. We'll explore how master masons and theologians used principles like the golden ratio and the vesica Piscis not only to construct breathtaking cathedrals, but to encode deep spiritual truths and structure the social world around them. This was a time when faith and science were not opposing forces but partners in a grand project to bring heaven down to earth. From the sweeping arches of Gothic vaults to the intricate layouts of monastic cloisters, sacred geometry served as a bridge between the earthly and the eternal, a visual and symbolic language that everyone, from kings to commoners, could understand on an intuitive level. What's even more remarkable is how these ideas continue to resonate today. The same geometric principles that guided the construction of medieval cathedrals can be found in nature, art, and modern design, proof that this pursuit of harmony is a timeless human impulse. So whether you're fascinated by history, inspired by spirituality, or simply curious about the hidden order behind beautiful spaces, you're in the right place. We're about to embark on a journey into the heart of sacred geometry, decoding its symbols, understanding its power, and discovering how it helped shape the world we've inherited. This is a story of human ingenuity, divine inspiration, and the eternal quest for meaning through form and number. Let's begin. Long before the first Gothic cathedral pierced the sky, the seeds of sacred geometry were being sown in the ancient world. It was in the sun-baked lands of Egypt, where the Nile's predictable floods necessitated a mastery of measurement, that geometry first emerged as a practical science for surveying land. But the Egyptians quickly saw something more in these perfect shapes and precise angles. To them, geometry was a bridge to the divine, a way to understand the eternal order of the universe. This is powerfully evident in the Great Pyramid of Giza, a structure whose base perimeter divided by twice its height yields a startlingly accurate approximation of pi, suggesting a profound, perhaps spiritual, understanding of mathematical constants. This fascination with the divine nature of form was then carried forward into classical Greece, where it blossomed into a full-fledged philosophical pursuit. The philosopher Pythagoras, who many believe traveled to Egypt and was initiated into these mysteries, returned to found a school built on a revolutionary idea. He taught that all of reality was fundamentally mathematical, that numbers and the geometric forms they created were the very building blocks of the cosmos. For the Pythagoreans, the simple act of drawing a perfect triangle with a compass and straightedge wasn't just drafting. It was an act of touching the eternal, a meditation on the unchanging truths that underpinned a chaotic world. They discovered that harmonious musical intervals could be expressed as simple whole number ratios, leading them to believe that the same ratios must govern the harmony of the planets, the famous music of the spheres. This concept was expanded by Plato centuries later. In his dialogue Timaeus, he described a divine craftsman, or demiurge, who fashioned the chaotic void of the universe into a cosmos of order and beauty using what we now call the Platonic solids. These 5 perfect 3-dimensional shapes, the tetrahedron, cube, octahedron, dodecahedron, and icosahedron, were assigned to the fundamental elements of fire, earth, air, ether, and water. In Plato's view, the entire physical world was quite literally constructed from sacred geometry. This wasn't merely allegory. It was a cosmological model that placed mathematics at the very heart of creation, a concept that would deeply resonate with medieval Christian scholars. But how did this ancient Greek wisdom survive the collapse of the Roman Empire and find its way into the heart of medieval Europe? The crucial link was the Islamic Golden Age. As Europe entered its so-called Dark Ages, scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba were actively preserving, translating, and expanding upon the classical texts of Greece, including the geometric works of Euclid. Islamic art and architecture, forbidden from using human imagery, became a breathtaking canvas for complex geometric patterns, endless tessellations, and star polygons that symbolized the infinite and unending nature of God. These designs, along with advanced mathematical texts on algebra and trigonometry, slowly filtered into Europe through trade routes in Spain and Italy, and through the Crusades. Meanwhile, within the walls of isolated European monasteries, monks were meticulously copying and preserving the fragments of classical knowledge that remained. Within these silent scriptoria, the works of Plato and the principles of geometry were not seen as pagan threats, but as lost pieces of a universal truth that belonged to God. They read in the Book of Wisdom that God had ordered all things in measure and number and weight, which they interpreted as a divine endorsement for their mathematical studies. By the 12th century, this rediscovered knowledge, combined with a new spirit of architectural ambition, converged perfectly. The time was ripe for a revolution in building, and sacred geometry provided the perfect language, a timeless, universal code that allowed master masons to translate a vision of heavenly harmony into stone and glass, creating the first awe-inspiring Gothic cathedrals. So if the ancient world saw geometry as a key to the cosmos, the medieval master masons saw it as a toolbox for building heaven on earth. And the most powerful tools in that box were the simplest shapes, each one imbued with layer upon layer of profound symbolic meaning. For these builders, a circle was never just a circle. Its continuous, unbroken line, having no beginning and no end, was the ultimate representation of eternity, divine perfection, and the infinite nature of God. This is why the rose window isn't just a window, it's a massive, glowing emblem of heavenly order, a circular promise of God's eternal presence. When you stand directly beneath it and look up, the entire universe seems to rotate around that single, perfect point, pulling your gaze and your spirit upward. In direct contrast to the divine circle, the square represented the solid, stable, and earthly realm. It symbolized the 4 cardinal directions, the 4 elements of earth, air, fire, and water, and the 4 seasons. This was the shape of foundation and order. You see this most clearly in the layout of the cathedral's crossing, where the nave and transept intersect to form a massive square at the heart of the building. This space grounds the entire structure, a symbolic representation of the world created by God. It's the meeting place of the congregation, the stable earthly foundation from which the soul can aspire to reach the heavenly circle above. The square was a reminder of the material world, but a world that was created good and ordered by a rational God. Then there is the triangle, particularly the equilateral triangle where all sides and angles are equal. This shape became the preeminent symbol for the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, three distinct persons existing in one indivisible unity. The triangle's inherent stability and its upward-pointing apex made it a natural symbol for ascension, directing the eye and the heart toward heaven. This is why the pointed Gothic arch, essentially two halves of a triangle meeting at the top, feels so different from the rounded Romanesque arch. It isn't merely a stylistic change, it's a theological statement, a physical manifestation of the soul's yearning to rise from the earthly square toward the divine circle. Every arched doorway and window became a silent sermon on the Trinity, but the real magic, the true alchemy, happened when these basic shapes were combined. The intersection of two circles creates a shape known as the vesica Piscis, or mandorla, an almond-like form that was seen as a sacred generative portal. This shape frames Christ in majesty in countless mosaics and paintings, representing the intersection of heaven and earth, the divine breaking into our reality. It also became the fundamental geometric module from which other proportions were derived, the starting point for laying out the entire cathedral's plan. Another powerful composite shape was the pentagram, a five-pointed star formed by connecting the points of a pentagon. Far from the modern associations with magic or the occult, the medieval mind saw the pentagram as a symbol of the human microcosm. The 5 points corresponded to the 5 wounds of Christ, but also to the 5 senses of the human body. It represented the belief that humanity itself was created in God's geometric image, a smaller reflection of the cosmic order. For a population that was largely illiterate, these shapes and patterns were not decoration. They were a primary language of faith. The entire cathedral functioned as a vast, three-dimensional Bible. A pilgrim walking through the nave didn't need to read Latin to understand the stories told in the stained glass. They could feel the stability of the square beneath their feet, see the aspiration of the triangular arches overhead, and be bathed in the luminous eternity of the circular rose window. Each line, angle, and proportion was a word in this visual sermon, teaching complex theology through intuitive form. The architecture itself was doing the work of a priest, instructing, inspiring, and elevating the spirit through the silent, universal language of sacred geometry. And just as the cathedral's basic shapes spoke a silent, symbolic language, its most profound harmonies were achieved through the application of specific, powerful ratios, mathematical relationships that seemed to whisper from the very fabric of creation itself. The most celebrated of these is the golden ratio, often denoted by the Greek letter phi, approximately 1.618. This irrational number possesses a unique property. If you divide a line so that the longer part divided by the smaller part is equal to the whole length divided by the longer part, you've found this divine proportion. It's a ratio that creates a sense of perfect, dynamic balance, and it appears with astonishing frequency in the natural world. You can see it in the elegant spiral of a nautilus shell, the unfurling pattern of a fern frond, and even the arrangement of seeds in the center of a sunflower. To the medieval mind, this wasn't a coincidence, it was a signature. The recurrence of this ratio in nature was viewed as clear evidence of God's handiwork, a geometric proof of a rational and beautifully ordered cosmos. Medieval architects, deeply steeped in this worldview, sought to incorporate this divine signature into their own creations. They believed that by building according to the same ratios that govern the natural world, they could make their structures feel inherently sacred and harmonious. While they may not have used the precise algebraic calculations a modern mathematician would, they had practical, geometric methods for constructing the golden ratio using only a compass and a straight edge. You can find its influence throughout cathedral design. The overall floor plan of a nave might be laid out as a series of overlapping squares and rectangles whose proportions approximate the golden ratio. The elevation of the facade, the relationship between the width of the central portal and the rose window above it, even the spacing of columns, all of these elements were often carefully calibrated to reflect this divine proportion. The goal was to create a building that felt intuitively right, whose beauty was not just seen but felt in the soul, because it echoed the fundamental patterns of God's creation. Closely related to the golden ratio is the Fibonacci sequence, a series of numbers where each number is the sum of the two preceding ones: 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, and so on. As the sequence progresses, the ratio between successive numbers gets closer and closer to phi, the golden ratio. This mathematical pattern is brilliantly visible in the spiral arrangements of pine cones and sunflower heads. Builders intuitively understood the aesthetic power of these increasing proportions. They used them to create a sense of organic, unfolding growth within the stonework. A perfect example is the design of a spiral staircase within a cathedral tower. The steps might radiate out from a central newel post in a widening pattern that follows the Fibonacci sequence, creating a visually pleasing and structurally sound ascent that feels both natural and inevitable. This application of mathematical sequences wasn't merely an intellectual exercise, it was a deeply spiritual act. By weaving the Fibonacci spiral into the tracery of a rose window or the ribbing of a vault, the Masons were literally building the laws of creation into the house of God. They were constructing a microcosm, a small, perfect model of the universe as they believed it to be, ordered, rational, and beautiful. When a medieval worshipper entered this space, they may not have been consciously aware of the math, but they would have felt its effects. The building's proportions created a subliminal sense of peace and rightness. The eye is naturally drawn along these harmonious lines, upward from the earthly square of the floor, through the ascending triangles of the arches, and toward the divine circle of the vaults and windows. This visual journey was a geometric metaphor for the soul's own path toward God, making the complex theology of ascension and harmony something a person could experience with their entire body, not just understand with their mind. The architecture itself became a silent guide, using the very language of creation to elevate the human spirit. This masterful fusion of the cross and the circle in the cathedral floor plan was far more than a symbolic gesture. It was a carefully choreographed experience designed to guide a pilgrim's every step toward spiritual transformation. As you entered through the west door, often adorned with scenes of the Last Judgment, you were symbolically leaving the world of sin and mortality behind. You then stepped into the long, processional space of the nave, the vertical arm of the cross stretching out before you. This was the domain of the laity, the common people. Its sheer length wasn't just for grandeur, it was a deliberate elongation of the journey, forcing a slow, purposeful walk toward the sacred east end. Lined with massive columns that rose like a stone forest, the nave's rhythmic bays created a sense of measured progression, each step a move away from the profane world and closer to the divine. Your journey would eventually bring you to the crossing, the very heart of the cathedral where the long nave intersects with the shorter transept, forming the crossbar of the crucifix. This central square was a space of convergence, both architecturally and symbolically. It was often topped by a soaring tower or dome, marking it as the axis mundi, the spiritual center of the universe where heaven and earth met. Here you were standing at the symbolic crossroads of human existence, directly beneath the point where the earthly square met the celestial circle. From this central point, you could look down each arm of the cross, visually comprehending the entire sacred layout, a physical manifestation of faith itself. Moving beyond the crossing, you approach the most sacred area, the east end, comprising the choir for the clergy and the semicircular apse housing the high altar. This area was frequently raised by a few steps, a subtle but powerful architectural cue that you were ascending to a higher spiritual plane. The apse, with its curved wall, reintroduced the circle, representing the perfection and eternity of heaven. It was here, at the altar, the symbolic site of Christ's sacrifice, that the two primary geometries culminated. The linear path of the cross, representing the historical event of crucifixion, met the eternal, unending circle of divine glory. This convergence taught a powerful lesson. The singular act of sacrifice was the gateway to eternal life. Integrating circular elements within this cruciform plan added another profound layer of meaning. The most famous example is the labyrinth, often inlaid into the floor of the nave. Unlike a maze with dead ends, a labyrinth has a single, winding but unambiguous path leading to a central goal. For pilgrims who could not travel to Jerusalem, walking the labyrinth on their knees was a substitute pilgrimage, a miniature, meditative journey of repentance and redemption. The geometric precision of its circuitous path, often based on complex circular patterns, provided a structured ritual for contemplation. Each turn represented a stage of the spiritual journey, making the abstract process of salvation something tangible and physical. Similarly, some cathedrals featured rounded choirs, where the clergy's stalls were arranged in a semicircle, facilitating antiphonal singing and reflecting the unity and harmony of the celestial order. Every architectural decision, from the grand sweep of the nave to the intricate turns of the labyrinth, was a deliberate tool for shaping a worshipper's inner experience, turning a simple walk through a building into a powerful reenactment of the soul's journey from a world of flux toward divine and eternal unity. Now, if you take that most sacred of shapes, the circle, representing the divine and eternal, and you intersect it with another circle of exactly the same size, you create one of the most potent and foundational symbols in all of sacred geometry, the vesica Piscis. The name itself, Latin for bladder of a fish, describes the almond-like form that appears in the center where the two circles overlap, but its meaning goes far deeper than its simple construction. This shape was seen by medieval theologians and masons as nothing less than a geometric portal, a sacred intersection where two separate realms, heaven and earth, spirit and matter, divine and human, meet and interlock. It was the first moment of creation, the generative womb of the universe from which all other forms and proportions could be born. This wasn't just a philosophical idea, it was a practical blueprint for the master mason. The vesica Piscis became an essential geometric tool for establishing the harmonious proportions of the entire cathedral. Using a simple rope or a compass, a mason could start with this one shape and derive a whole system of related dimensions. For instance, the height of the vesica Piscis in relation to its width provides a ratio that is very close to the square root of 3, another important irrational number in sacred geometry. This ratio was then used to determine the ideal relationship between the width of the nave and the height of its vaulted ceiling. The shape could be replicated and rotated to create equilateral triangles and hexagons, forming the basis for the intricate patterns in window tracery and floor tiles. So, the entire architectural symphony of a Gothic cathedral, with its soaring heights and perfect balances, often found its genesis in this single, elegant form. Nowhere is the symbolic power of the vesica Piscis more visually stunning than in its manifestation as the mandorla in religious art. Look at any medieval mosaic, painting, or sculpture depicting Christ in majesty or the Virgin Mary being assumed into heaven, and you will see them framed within this glowing, almond-shaped aura of light. This is not a random artistic choice. The mandorla is a direct representation of the vesica Piscis, and it serves a profound purpose. It visually defines a liminal space, a threshold where a sacred figure exists simultaneously in both the divine and earthly realms. When you see Christ enclosed within a mandorla, you are being shown a moment of ultimate revelation, a breach in the fabric of reality where divine glory becomes momentarily visible to mortal eyes. The mandorla announces that you are witnessing a miracle, a point of contact with the transcendent. This idea of crossing a threshold was made physically real for every person who entered a cathedral. The great arched doorways, often arranged in a triple configuration on the west facade, were frequently designed based on the proportions of the vesica Piscis. To walk through that arch was to literally pass through this geometric portal, leaving the mundane world of the town square and entering a sanctified realm. This transition was heightened by the art surrounding the doorway, sculpted figures of saints and prophets, and most importantly, the tympanum above the door, which often depicted Christ presiding over the Last Judgment, himself housed within a massive mandorla. You didn't just walk into a building, you passed through the gateway of salvation from a world of chaos and sin into a universe of divine order and light. And once inside, that divine light was made manifest. The stained glass windows, particularly the early Gothic lancet windows that often flanked the great rose window, frequently took their tall, narrow, pointed form from the vesica Piscis. When the sun streamed through these windows, it projected pools of brilliantly colored light onto the floor and columns, transforming the stone interior into a shimmering, celestial tapestry. The light itself was the final and most important element. Medieval thought held that ordinary sunlight was lux, but light that had been filtered through the colored glass of a sacred geometric window became lumen, a spiritualized, divine light that illuminated the soul. So the vesica Piscis, from the grand arch of the doorway to the shape of the windows themselves, acted as a lens, not just structuring the stone, but filtering and sanctifying the very light that filled the space, bathing every visitor in a luminous reminder that they were standing in a place where heaven and earth became one. Soaring above the heads of medieval worshippers, the ribbed vaults of a Gothic cathedral did far more than just hold up the roof. They painted a picture of the universe itself. If the basic geometric shapes were the alphabet of this sacred language, then the vaulting was its epic poetry, a three-dimensional map of celestial order written in stone. The engineering breakthrough was revolutionary. Unlike the heavy, barrel vaults of earlier Romanesque churches that required massive, thick walls for support, the Gothic system was a masterclass in efficient weight distribution. Think of it as a skeletal structure. The stone ribs, carefully pre-cut to precise geometric templates, formed the primary load-bearing framework, channeling the immense weight of the roof downward along distinct, graceful lines to the columns and piers below. This ingenious system meant the walls between these structural points no longer had to be solid fortresses. They could be dramatically thinner, pierced with enormous windows that flooded the interior with the divine, colored light of stained glass. But to see this only as a technical achievement is to miss its true genius. For the medieval mind, there was no separation between the practical and the symbolic. The network of ribs arching overhead was consciously designed to evoke the canopy of heaven. The main ribs, called diagonals, would sweep from the top of a column, crossing the space of the ceiling to meet their counterpart from the opposite column, creating a series of X-shaped patterns overhead. This wasn't just a structural necessity, it was a representation of the celestial vault, the dome of the sky arching over God's creation. The points where the ribs met were often adorned with elaborately carved stone bosses depicting foliage, saints, or biblical scenes. These bosses were more than decoration. They were like stars fixed in their celestial positions, anchoring the cosmic map above. The complexity of these vaults evolved over time, becoming a visual language for expressing an ever more sophisticated understanding of divine harmony. Early Gothic vaults might feature simple quadripartite designs, where two diagonal ribs divided each bay into 4 sections. But as the style progressed, masons introduced additional ribs called tiercerons and leons that didn't carry any major structural load. Instead, their purpose was almost purely symbolic and aesthetic. These secondary ribs wove intricate patterns, stars, webs, and complex geometric networks across the ceiling. In a vault like the magnificent one over the nave of Exeter Cathedral, you see a breathtaking stone tapestry overhead, a dizzying array of ribs that seems to have no beginning and no end. This creates a powerful effect of infinite complexity and order, a visual metaphor for the mind of God, infinitely knowable in its logical structure, yet ultimately mysterious in its depth. The spaces between the ribs, known as the webbing, were filled with thinner panels of stone. This relationship between the rib and the web is profoundly symbolic. The ribs represent the eternal, unchanging laws of God, the fixed structure of divine logic that underpins all of reality. The webbing, by contrast, represents the created, material world that is shaped and held together by that divine framework. One is permanent and defining, the other is contingent and supported. When you stand beneath it, your eye is irresistibly drawn along the lines of the ribs, tracing their paths as they converge and ascend. This architectural choreography guides your gaze and with it, your spirit upward, creating a visceral feeling of ascent from the material world below toward the spiritual realm above. The entire vault becomes a dynamic guide for contemplation, its geometry actively pulling you toward heaven. This experience was profoundly intentional. The master masons who designed these spaces were not just builders, they were theologians in stone. They understood that to create a space that truly felt sacred, it had to do more than just look impressive. It had to shape the psychological and spiritual experience of everyone inside. The rhythmic repetition of vaulted bay after bay down the length of the nave creates a hypnotic processional rhythm like a visual chant. The intricate patterning overhead gives the impression of a vast, ordered, and benevolent cosmos. In a world that could often be harsh, unpredictable, and short, the cathedral vault offered a vision of perfect stability, harmony, and transcendence. It was a constant stone and mortar reminder that behind the apparent chaos of daily life was a divine framework of exquisite order, a cosmic network in which every soul had its place, held securely in the embrace of a rational and beautiful design. While the ribbed vaults mapped the celestial heavens above, it was the rose window that brought the sun itself into the sacred equation, transforming raw daylight into a symphony of colored theology. To call it a window is almost an understatement. It was a massive, geometric eye gazing inward, a radiant mandala of stone and glass that served as the focal point of the entire cathedral's west end or transepts. Its very form, a perfect circle, was a direct symbol of God's eternal nature without beginning or end, a complete and perfect whole. But within that circle, the medieval masons worked a miracle of complexity, using the principles of sacred geometry to divide the universal into the particular, to give form to the formless, and to tell the story of divine wisdom unfolding into the world. The construction of a rose window began not with glass, but with geometry. Master masons would first lay out its design on a full-scale tracing floor, using compasses and straightedges to create a series of concentric circles. From a single central point, they would then mark out radiating spokes, dividing the circle into perfectly equal segments. The number of these segments was never arbitrary. Most commonly, you find 12 spokes, each one representing one of the 12 apostles. the foundational pillars of the church who carried Christ's message out into the world. In other windows, you might find 8 segments, the number 8 symbolizing resurrection and new beginnings, as Christ rose on the day after the seventh-day Sabbath. The geometry itself was preaching, encoding core doctrines of the faith into the very armature of the window. Between these spokes, the masons then wove an intricate web of stone tracery, the delicate, lace-like framework that holds the glass. This is where the geometry truly soars, creating patterns of breathtaking complexity. They employed a repertoire of shapes derived from the basic geometric toolkit: trefoils 3-lobed patterns for the Trinity, quatrefoils 4-lobed for the evangelists, and even more elaborate star polygons and intersecting arcs. This stone web was far more than structural. It was a visual representation of the interconnectedness of all creation, a cosmic network where every line and curve was held in perfect, rational balance. It was the fixed, eternal law of God made visible in stone, and into this geometric framework, glaziers then set thousands of pieces of hand-blown, colored glass, each one a tiny jewel. The choice of color was also deeply symbolic. Deep cobalt blue represented the vault of heaven, celestial truth, and the Virgin Mary. Fiery red embodied the passion of Christ and the burning love of the Holy Spirit. Glowing gold signified the light of God's glory and the saints in heaven. Pure green spoke of creation, growth, and eternal life. These colored pieces were arranged to form intricate narrative scenes from the Bible, rings of prophets and saints, or symbolic representations of the virtues and vices. The window became a massive circular storybook, its narrative unfolding from the center outward, from the divine source to its manifestation in the world. Then, at the appointed hour, the sun would cooperate in this divine theater. Sunlight streaming through the colored glass would project the entire geometric symphony inward, casting a shimmering, ever-changing pattern of light and color onto the opposite wall, across the stone floor, and onto the people below. This transformed the entire space. The cold, gray stone was suddenly alive with moving rainbows. The light itself became sanctified. It was no longer mere illumination but lumen, a spiritual light that was believed to illuminate the soul as it illuminated the building. As the sun moved across the sky, the patterns would shift and dance, making the geometry feel dynamic and alive, a constant reminder of the living presence of God within the ordered structure of creation. Standing in the nave and looking up at this spectacle, a medieval worshipper would experience a profound meditation on the nature of reality. The sturdy, unchanging stone tracery represented the eternal, perfect, and rational structure of divine law, the framework that holds everything together. The fragile, brilliantly colored glass represented the created world, beautiful, temporary, and contingent upon that higher structure. And the sunlight pouring through it all was the grace of God, the animating spirit that brings both structure and matter to life, transforming them into an experience of transcendent beauty. The rose window was the ultimate expression of the medieval worldview, a perfect fusion of structure and spirit, where mathematics and art, faith and reason, stone and light, met and became one glorious whole, offering a glimpse of heaven's perfect order to all who had eyes to see. This deep integration of mathematics into the very purpose of education stemmed from a world view where the physical universe was seen as a book, a second scripture written by the hand of God. If the Bible was God's word revealed, then nature was God's work revealed, and both required study to understand their author. The 7 liberal arts were the essential tools for this study, divided into the foundational trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, which taught the art of language and thought, and the advanced quadrivium, which taught the art of numbers and their relationships. This wasn't a dry academic curriculum. It was a spiritual training ground, To master arithmetic was to understand the divine principle of unity and multiplicity. To study astronomy was to trace the movements of the heavenly spheres, the most perfect and visible manifestation of God's orderly clockwork. Music was the study of harmonic ratios, the unheard mathematical relationships that governed everything from a plucked string to the motion of planets. And geometry was the crown of them all, the tangible expression of all these principles in visible, measurable form. Geometry held this preeminent position because it was believed to be the language God used to create. This wasn't a vague metaphor, it was a theological certainty drawn directly from Scripture. The Book of Wisdom, chapter 11, verse 20, states unequivocally that God had ordered all things in measure and number and weight. For medieval scholars, this was a divine mandate to study the world through mathematics, to measure the proportions of a building, to calculate the number of bays in a nave, to weigh the structural forces at play. These were not secular acts. They were acts of devotion, a way of reverse engineering the mind of the Creator. By discovering the geometric rules underlying nature, they felt they were glimpsing the very blueprints of creation, apprehending the eternal, rational patterns that existed in God's mind before the foundation of the world. A perfectly drawn circle wasn't just a shape, it was a participation in divine perfection. This philosophical framework directly shaped the very stones of the cathedral. The master architects, often clerics or deeply religious laymen, were almost certainly educated in these principles. They understood that the same mathematical ratios that created a harmonious musical chord could also create a harmonious space. This concept, known as musica universalis or the music of the spheres, was applied directly to architectural design. The ratios that produce pleasing musical intervals, like the octave 2-1, the fifth 3-2, and the fourth 4-3, were translated into spatial relationships. The width of the nave might relate to its height in a 2-1 ratio, a visual octave. The dimensions of the crossing square could be based on a 3-2 ratio, a visual fifth. This ensured that the building didn't just look right, it felt right. It resonated with a subliminal harmony that echoed the structure of the cosmos itself, making the space feel inherently sacred and balanced to anyone inside, even if they couldn't articulate why. This holistic approach extended far beyond simple floor plans. The entire sensory experience of the cathedral was calibrated for cosmic harmony. The acoustics of the building were carefully considered. The reverberation time, how long a note from a choir or a spoken prayer hung in the air, was shaped by the vaults and arches, designed to amplify the human voice and create a lingering, ethereal sound that felt otherworldly. This was architecture collaborating with music to elevate the liturgy. Furthermore, the orientation of the entire building was an astronomical act. Cathedrals were almost always aligned with their altar at the east end, toward the rising sun, a symbol of Christ, the Son of Righteousness. But this alignment was often precise, calculated to catch the first rays of the dawn on specific feast days, illuminating a particular relic or altar with a shaft of light that felt like a divine benediction. From the largest overall dimension down to the timing of a sunbeam, every single aspect was infused with meaning, a testament to the belief that through the quadrivium, humanity could build a house that truly reflected the magnificent, mathematical, and harmonious order of God's universe. Behind every soaring arch and every precisely cut stone stood a figure who was part architect, part mystic, and part master craftsman, the medieval master mason. These men were far more than just skilled builders. They were the living guardians of an ancient and sacred tradition, the inheritors of geometric secrets passed down through generations. They occupied a unique and powerful position in medieval society, bridging the gap between the physical labor of the stonemason and the intellectual speculation of the theologian. While the clergy provided the theological vision for the cathedral, it was the master mason who possessed the practical, esoteric knowledge to translate that vision into stone and light, making him an indispensable partner in this grand spiritual enterprise. The training of a master mason was a long and rigorous process, often beginning in childhood as an apprentice within a tightly knit guild. These guilds were more than just early labor unions. They were secretive societies that protected their trade secrets with the fervor of a sacred trust. The knowledge of how to construct a perfect pentagram using only a compass and straightedge, or how to derive the golden ratio from a simple square, was not written down in books available to all. It was transmitted orally and through practical demonstration from master to apprentice, often in the symbolic language of ritual and custom. This secrecy served a dual purpose. It protected the guild's economic monopoly on these high-level skills, and it preserved the sacred nature of the knowledge, ensuring it was only used by those who understood its profound spiritual significance. To know these secrets was to hold a key to the divine order of the universe, a responsibility not taken lightly. Their workshop was often the cathedral floor itself. Before a single stone was quarried, the master mason would create a full-scale drawing of a complex window tracery or vault designed directly on a flat, plaster-covered surface known as a tracing floor. Using a metal stylus, he would incise the precise geometric lines of the design into the plaster, creating a detailed blueprint that could be consulted by the craftsman. This drawing was a masterpiece of applied geometry, an intricate web of circles, arcs, and lines that defined every cut and angle. The craftsman would then use simple tools, a set of compasses for perfect circles, a straight edge for true lines, and knotted ropes for measuring consistent proportions to create wooden templates. These templates were the crucial link between the abstract drawing and the physical stone. A carpenter would shape a piece of wood to match the template, and a stonemason would then use that wooden pattern to guide his chisel as he carved the actual block. The true genius of the master mason lay in his ability to think and work in 3 dimensions. He had to visualize how these 2-dimensional geometric patterns on the tracing floor would translate into the complex, interlocking volumes of a ribbed vault or a spiral staircase. He understood structural forces intuitively, knowing exactly how to distribute weight so that a delicate-looking fan vault could support a massive roof, creating spaces that seemed to defy gravity. This expertise was a blend of inherited tradition, empirical observation, and profound geometric understanding. The resulting structures possessed an intuitive balance and harmony that could be felt even by an illiterate laborer who knew nothing of the underlying ratios. The space simply felt right, inspiring, uplifting, and solid because it was built according to the same universal principles that govern natural forms. This combination of high-level knowledge and manual skill gave the master mason a unique social status. He was often highly paid, well-traveled, and enjoyed a level of respect and autonomy rare for a non-noble in feudal society. He moved from one great building project to another across Europe, carrying his knowledge and his set of personal tools with him. In this way, he became a vital agent of cultural exchange, spreading new stylistic and technical innovations from Paris to Prague. The master mason was not just shaping stone, he was shaping the very landscape of Christendom, creating the physical landmarks that defined medieval life. His work provided a tangible, enduring symbol of community identity and divine order, making him a key figure in the creation of both the physical and the social fabric of the medieval world, a quiet architect of awe whose legacy continues to inspire wonder centuries after his tools were laid to rest. Entering a medieval cathedral was like stepping into a perfect model of the universe as the church saw it, a divinely ordained hierarchy where every person, from the lowest peasant to the highest king, had a fixed and purposeful place. This wasn't an accidental outcome of the design, it was the entire point. The architectural layout served as a powerful, three-dimensional diagram of the social and spiritual order, reinforcing the feudal structure that organized medieval life. The vast interior was meticulously zoned, each area corresponding to a distinct level of this sacred hierarchy, creating a physical manifestation of the great chain of being that governed all of creation. The journey began in the nave, the long central aisle that made up the bulk of the cathedral's interior. This was the domain of the common people, the merchants, artisans, and peasants. Its sheer size was necessary to accommodate the masses, especially on high feast days, but its design was far from democratic. The nave was often separated from the more sacred eastern end by a massive stone screen called a pulpitum, or sometimes even a rude screen topped with a crucifix. This barrier was both physical and symbolic. It marked a clear boundary, visually and spatially reminding the laity that they were spectators in the sacred drama of the Mass, not participants. They stood on the cold stone floor, often in dim light, their view of the high altar partially obscured. This experience reinforced their position at the base of the social and spiritual pyramid, a constant architectural reminder of their humble station in both the earthly and divine realms. Beyond the screen lay the choir, an enclosed space filled with ornately carved wooden stalls. This was the preserve of the clergy, the priests, canons, and monks who performed the divine offices throughout the day. Their elevated role in mediating between God and humanity was reflected in their privileged access to this sacred space. Seated within the choir, they were closer to the altar, both physically and symbolically. Their rituals, sung in Latin, were often conducted with their backs to the congregation, facing east. This orientation emphasized that their primary duty was to God on behalf of the people, not directly to the people themselves. The choir represented the intermediate layer of society, the educated, spiritual class whose duty was to pray, to interpret God's will, and to guide the souls of the laity toward salvation. At the far eastern end, bathed in the most light from the apse windows, stood the high altar. This was the most sacred spot in the entire building, the symbolic throne of God on earth and the repository for the consecrated Eucharist. Access to this area was severely restricted, typically reserved for the highest-ranking clergy officiating the Mass. This spatial segregation mirrored the ultimate hierarchy, the immense gap between the divine and the human. The altar's separation taught a powerful lesson about the transcendence and otherness of God. Even the nobility, for all their earthly power, were typically denied direct access to this most holy place. They might have their own private side chapels dedicated to their patron saints, often adorned with their coats of arms, signaling their privileged status above the common folk, but still decidedly below the divine. This carefully orchestrated spatial hierarchy was a masterstroke of social control. It presented the rigid inequalities of feudal society, with its kings, lords, knights, and serfs, not as a man-made system of power and oppression, but as a reflection of a cosmic, God-given order. The architecture naturalized social stratification, making it seem as inevitable and righteous as the rising of the sun. To challenge one's place in society was to challenge the very architecture of the universe as designed by God. Yet there was a crucial unifying element, the shared space under the same magnificent, vaulted ceiling. On a fundamental level, everyone, from the lowliest beggar to the most powerful bishop, was subject to the same divine law, saved by the same grace, and awed by the same overwhelming beauty. This brilliant combination of division and unity used stone and light to promote a powerful ideology of social cohesion, suggesting that earthly peace and stability depended on everyone accepting their God-ordained place within the grand geometric design of creation. While the soaring vaults and stained glass windows captured the heavens above, another profound geometric feature was often laid right at the feet of the worshipper, a path of transformation etched into the very floor of the cathedral. The Labyrinth, most famously the grand example at Chartres Cathedral, offered a powerful and deeply personal spiritual experience accessible to everyone. In an age where a physical pilgrimage to the Holy Land was a dangerous, expensive, and often impossible undertaking for the vast majority of people, the Church provided a powerful alternative. Walking the labyrinth's circuitous path became a substitute pilgrimage, a symbolic journey to the heavenly Jerusalem that required no wealth or privilege, only a willing heart and a pair of knees often worn from the slow, penitential journey. The first thing to understand is that a labyrinth is fundamentally different from a maze, a distinction that holds deep symbolic meaning. A maze is a puzzle designed to confuse, with dead ends, forks, and choices intended to challenge and often frustrate the traveler. It is a game of the intellect. A labyrinth, by beautiful contrast, has only a single, winding but unambiguous path. There are no choices to make, no wrong turns to take. The way in is the way out. This design eliminates any anxiety about getting lost, freeing the walker to fully immerse themselves in meditation and prayer. The path itself, with all its unexpected turns and switchbacks, becomes a metaphor for the journey of life, a path that often feels confusing and circuitous, but is ultimately held within a greater, divine design that guarantees safe passage to the center and back again. The geometry of these labyrinths was meticulously planned, most following a complex circular pattern divided into quadrants, often with 11 concentric circuits. The number 11 was itself significant, sometimes seen as a symbol of sin, transgression, and imperfection, standing between the perfection of 10, the commandments, and 12, the apostles. Walking these 11 rings could thus be seen as a journey through and away from sin. The path was not a straight line to grace. It involved constantly shifting directions, moving sometimes alarmingly close to the center only to be sent back toward the outer edge. This mirrored the spiritual life where progress is rarely linear, involving setbacks and surprises that ultimately serve to deepen one's faith and reliance on divine guidance. The center of the labyrinth, the goal of the entire journey, was typically a rounded or floral design, a symbolic representation of Jerusalem, paradise, or union with God. Reaching this center was a moment of profound spiritual attainment, a taste of heavenly peace and clarity. But the ritual didn't end there. After a period of prayer and contemplation in the center, the pilgrim would then turn around and walk the same path back out, returning to the everyday world. This return journey was just as important as the inward one. It symbolized the pilgrim's responsibility to bring the insights and peace gained in the center back into their daily life, to live as a changed person in their community. This practice was a remarkable democratization of the sacred experience. In a building whose layout otherwise emphasized social hierarchy, with separate spaces for laity, clergy, and nobility, the labyrinth was available to all. A poor farmer and a wealthy merchant would walk the exact same path, undergoing the same symbolic struggles and receiving the same symbolic grace. It required no literacy, no theological training, and no special status. The only requirement was a humble and reflective spirit. In this way, the labyrinth served as a great spiritual equalizer, a geometric ritual etched in stone that offered every individual, regardless of their station in life, a structured and tangible way to enact their inner quest for meaning, repentance, and ultimate renewal. This deep connection between the heavens and the cathedral was made physically manifest through a practice known as orientation, a word that literally means facing east. The vast majority of medieval cathedrals were meticulously aligned so that the high altar, the spiritual heart of the building, was situated at the eastern end. This was no arbitrary decision based on the available town square real estate. It was a profound theological and astronomical statement. The east was the direction of the rising sun, and in Christian symbolism, Christ was referred to as the Sun of Righteousness, the light of the world dawning to conquer the darkness of sin. By orienting the entire building toward the dawn, the architects were ensuring that the structure itself participated in this daily drama of redemption, physically turning toward the source of all light and life. But the precision often went far beyond a simple general easterly direction. Many cathedrals were engineered with an even more specific alignment, designed to harness a singular, spectacular celestial event on one particular day of the year, the feast day of their patron saint. Imagine the scene on that morning. As the sun crests the horizon, its first rays would shoot through the landscape, pass through the main door of the cathedral, and travel the entire length of the nave like a laser beam, finally striking the high altar or a specific relic housed there at the exact moment of sunrise. This breathtaking effect transformed the building from a static object into a living instrument, a colossal sundial marking the most holy day in its local calendar. It was a moment of divine theater, a visible sign of heaven blessing the earthly church, making the abstract concept of a saint's intercession tangibly real for every witness. This sacred choreography of light extended to the solar calendar's other major milestones, the solstices and equinoxes. Windows were not just placed to let in light, they were strategically positioned to catch the sun's rays at its most extreme and balanced angles throughout the year. A specific lancet window in the south transept might be designed so that only on the winter solstice, when the sun is at its lowest and weakest point in the sky, a single, powerful beam of light would pierce the interior gloom and illuminate a statue of the Virgin Mary, symbolizing hope and renewal in the deepest dark. Conversely, on the summer solstice, light might flood a particular chapel dedicated to Saint John the Baptist, whose feast day is close to that date. These alignments turn the cathedral into a giant astronomical clock and calendar, its very stones marking the sacred rhythm of the seasons and the liturgical year. This practice was the polar opposite of superstition. It was the highest expression of a worldview that saw the cosmos as a single, integrated creation. Medieval scholars made no sharp distinction between astronomy and theology. They believed the heavens declared the glory of God, that the orderly, predictable motion of the planets and stars was the clearest possible evidence of a divine, rational mind behind the universe. To build a church in harmony with these cosmic rhythms was to participate in that divine rationality, to create a place where the boundary between heaven and earth became thin, almost transparent. The building became a microcosm, a little universe that reflected the order and beauty of the macrocosm, the great universe outside its walls. Every calculated sunbeam was a reminder that the same God who set the stars in their courses was intimately involved in the lives of those who worshipped within. While the master masons of Europe were perfecting their craft, a parallel revolution in mathematical and artistic thought was flourishing in the Islamic world, and its influence would profoundly reshape the very skyline of Christendom. This was not a story of conquest, but one of conversation, a remarkable cross-pollination of ideas facilitated by trade routes that snaked across the Mediterranean, the scholarly exchanges in multicultural cities like Toledo and Palermo, and even the fraught contact of the Crusades. In the great centers of Islamic learning, Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, geometry was not merely a tool for construction, it was a primary language for expressing the nature of God. Forbidden from representing the divine through human imagery, Islamic artists and architects turned to abstraction, developing an incredibly sophisticated visual vocabulary of infinite patterns to reflect the infinite, unending nature of Allah. Walking into the great mosque of Cordoba with its forest of arches crisscrossed in intricate, repeating patterns was meant to feel like stepping into a glimpse of the eternal, a universe of perfect, rational order. This Islamic approach to sacred geometry was fundamentally about creating a sense of boundless unity. Artists developed the arabesque, a flowing, interlacing pattern of foliage and geometric lines that seems to have no beginning and no end, symbolizing the infinite and indivisible nature of the divine. Even more impactful for Gothic architects was the mastery of complex star polygons. Islamic geometers perfected the design of elaborate, radiating star patterns, often with 8, 12, or even 16 points, which were used to dazzling effect in tilework, mosaics, and window screens known as mashrabiyah. These stars weren't just decorative, they were cosmological diagrams, representations of the heavens and the radiating power of creation. European builders, particularly those working in the emerging Gothic style, saw in these patterns a solution to their own artistic and structural ambitions. The rigid, rounded arches of the Romanesque style began to give way to something new, the pointed arch, a form prevalent in Islamic architecture for centuries. This wasn't a direct copy, but an adaptation, a spark of inspiration that ignited a new architectural possibility. The transfer of knowledge was profoundly practical. Along with stunning visual models, European scholars gained access to advanced mathematical texts preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars. Key works by ancient Greek mathematicians like Euclid, which had been lost to most of Europe after the fall of Rome, were reintroduced through Arabic translations, often with extensive new commentaries. These texts came bundled with Islamic advancements in algebra and trigonometry, disciplines essential for calculating complex angles and structural stresses. This new toolbox allowed master masons to think more audaciously. They could now calculate the precise angles needed for the ribs of a complex vault or the radiating tracery of a massive window with a confidence that was previously impossible. The sophisticated star patterns that began to appear in the stone tracery of Gothic rose windows are a direct testament to this influence, a geometric dialogue etched in stone and light. Perhaps the most beautiful aspect of this exchange is that it transcended the deep religious and political conflicts of the age. In the 13th century, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who ruled Sicily, maintained a court where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars worked side by side, translating texts and sharing ideas. In Spain, the translation schools of Toledo became engines of intellectual fusion, where the wisdom of the East was translated into Latin and disseminated across Europe. This demonstrates a powerful truth. Sacred geometry functioned as a universal language, a perfect geometric ratio, a flawless star polygon, a harmonious proportion. These were truths that resonated regardless of whether one was in a mosque, a synagogue, or a cathedral. They pointed to a universal order that different cultures interpreted through their own faith, but whose mathematical principles remained constant and true. This period of cross-cultural fertilization stands as a powerful reminder that humanity's greatest leaps in innovation rarely happen in isolation. They occur at the crossroads, in the bustling trading ports and vibrant scholarly centers where different traditions meet, mingle, and challenge one another. The Gothic Cathedral, that most iconic symbol of medieval Christendom, is in many ways a monument to this dialogue. Its soaring heights and luminous windows are unthinkable without the geometric genius that flowed from Islamic civilizations, a testament to the fact that beauty and truth have always been built through collaboration, a silent partnership of minds across cultures, all seeking to give form to the formless and to touch the eternal through the power of shape and number. But this breathtaking vision of harmony and light would have remained just a vision without the back-breaking, painstaking work of the stonemason. High above the tracing floors and the master's grand designs, in dusty yards filled with the constant chipping of iron on stone, the true magic of the cathedral was being forged. Here, men with calloused hands and a keen eye were engaged in a monumental three-dimensional puzzle, transforming rough, irregular blocks quarried from the earth into perfectly precise geometric components that would lock together to form a perfect whole. Without any of our modern technology, no power tools, no computer-aided design, no laser levels, they achieved a level of precision that would be the envy of many engineers today, and they did it all with a simple, sacred set of tools and an intimate knowledge of geometry. The master mason's full-scale drawing on the tracing floor was the ultimate blueprint, but it was useless without a way to translate that two-dimensional design into a three-dimensional stone. This is where the humble template came in. Craftsmen would create these patterns out of thin sheets of metal or wood, carefully shaped to match every curve, angle, and detail of the master's drawing. For a complex window like the rose window, there might be dozens of different templates, each one defining the exact profile of a specific stone in the intricate tracery. A mason would take his assigned block of stone, hold the template against it, and trace its shape with a metal scriber. His job was then to carve away everything that wasn't that perfect shape. This was a process of reduction, of revealing the ideal form hidden within the raw, chaotic material, a physical echo of the theological belief in bringing divine order out of earthly chaos. The tools for this transformation were few, but each was a masterpiece of simple efficiency. The compass was perhaps the most important, used not for drawing on paper, but for scribing perfect arcs and checking diameters directly onto the stone itself. The square ensured every angle was a true right angle, the fundamental building block of stability. Dividers were used to step off equal proportions and to transfer measurements from the template to the stone with unerring accuracy. And then there were the hammers and chisels, a whole family of them, from heavy punches for rough shaping to fine points and claws for delicate detailing. With these basic instruments, a skilled mason could create any shape imaginable, from the simple rectangular ashlars of the wall to the wildly complex, multi-faceted stones that formed the ribs of a vault or the delicate petals of a carved capital. But this work demanded far more than just manual dexterity. It required a profound, almost intuitive understanding of stereotomy, the geometric science of cutting solid materials into specific shapes. A mason had to visualize how the stone he was carving would fit with the stones above, below, and beside it. He needed to understand how the forces of gravity and compression would travel through the stone once it was in place. The joints between stones were rarely simple flat planes. They were often cut at complex angles, designed to lock together and distribute weight efficiently. The beautiful seams where two vault ribs meet, for instance, are not a simple 90-degree intersection. They are a complex, mitered joint that had to be calculated and cut with geometric precision so that all the forces would flow smoothly from one stone to the next, creating that miraculous impression of weightless stone lacework. This incredible craftsmanship is the silent, invisible hero of the Gothic Revolution. The breathtaking beauty of the cathedral, the soaring height, the flooded light, the intricate patterns, is directly born from this rigorous mathematical cutting and fitting. The reason those walls could be so thin and those windows so vast is because every stone was performing its structural duty with perfect efficiency. There was no room for error, no tolerance for a stone that was almost the right shape. A single badly cut keystone could compromise an entire vault. The harmony the visitor feels is not an illusion. It is the physical result of thousands of individual stones, each one a unique geometric masterpiece, all singing together in perfect structural and visual chorus. In the hands of the medieval mason, geometry was not an abstract theory. It was a physical discipline, a prayer made manifest through skill, patience, and an unwavering faith in the power of measure, number, and weight. This carefully choreographed path from west to east was the cathedral's master narrative, a spatial story written in stone and light that every visitor was compelled to enact. You didn't simply enter a building, you embarked on a symbolic pilgrimage, your very footsteps tracing the soul's journey from a state of sin toward divine grace. This profound experience began the moment you approached the west facade, often called the front of the church but symbolically the back of the world. Here, the sculpted scenes were dominated by the Last Judgment, with Christ presiding over the saved and the damned, a stark reminder of mortality and the consequences of a life lived without faith. Passing through this portal, you were symbolically leaving the profane world of everyday concerns and stepping into a sacred realm, consciously beginning a transformative journey. Once inside, the sheer length of the nave stretched before you, a processional pathway designed to slow your pace and focus your mind. This wasn't just a long hallway. Its dimensions were frequently calculated using sacred ratios, its rhythmic bays marked by columns that rose like a stone forest, creating a measured, almost musical progression down its length. The floor itself often subtly inclined upward as you moved eastward, a physical sensation of ascent that mirrored the spiritual climb you were undertaking. Your eyes, and with them your spirit, were irresistibly drawn forward by the converging lines of the arcades and upward by the soaring vaults, which grew progressively taller and more complex the closer you got to the crossing. This entire spatial composition worked in harmony to create a visceral feeling of being pulled toward something luminous and holy. Lining this sacred path, the stained glass windows acted as a sequential visual Bible, their glowing panels narrating scripture in the order you encountered them. Starting near the west end, you might see scenes from the Old Testament, the fall of man, the stories of Noah and Moses establishing the need for salvation. As you progressed, the windows would transition to the life of Christ, his birth, miracles, and teachings in the central nave, culminating in the ultimate sacrifice of the crucifixion as you neared the crossing. Finally, in the choir and apse at the far east end, the windows would blaze with the glory of the resurrection, the ascension, and the last judgment, now shown from the perspective of divine victory. This narrative sequence ensured that your physical movement through the space was synchronized with the story of redemption, your body literally walking through the timeline of salvation history. The journey reached its climax at the crossing, the symbolic center of the church, and the point where the horizontal axis of the nave met the vertical axis of the tower or dome above. This was the axis mundi, the meeting point of heaven and earth. From here, you turned finally to face the east end, where the raised sanctuary and high altar stood bathed in the most brilliant light from the apse windows. The geometry here became more complex and refined, the materials more precious, the light more ethereal. To step up into the choir and approach the altar was to complete the symbolic ascent, to move from the realm of humanity into the presence of the divine. This architectural choreography made complex theology immediately accessible, allowing every person, regardless of education or status, to physically experience the core Christian belief that life is a journey from a world of shadow toward the illuminating grace of God. a journey that finds its ultimate destination in the radiant promise of resurrection. For the medieval mind, light was not merely illumination. It was the physical manifestation of the divine, a tangible expression of God's grace pouring into the created world. This belief transformed the very purpose of a cathedral's windows. They were not just openings in a wall to let in the sun. They were carefully calibrated instruments designed to conduct a symphony of light, using the sun itself as their player and the sacred geometry of the tracery as their score. The master builders were, in effect, divine choreographers, using their knowledge of the sun's annual journey across the sky to stage a daily performance of breathtaking beauty and profound theological significance. Every hour brought a new scene in this celestial drama as the angle and intensity of the light shifted, dynamically altering the entire atmosphere within the stone vault. This manipulation of light was achieved with astonishing precision. The placement, size, and shape of every window were the result of deliberate geometric calculation. Lancet windows, those tall, narrow openings topped with a pointed arch, were often positioned to capture the low-lying sun of the winter months, projecting long, powerful shafts of light deep into the nave to combat the seasonal gloom. Conversely, the massive rose windows with their complex radial tracery were designed to be flooded by the high summer sun, transforming them into colossal, blazing jewels. The stone tracery itself, the intricate web of mullions dividing the glass, acted as a sacred filter. As sunlight passed through, it didn't just illuminate the interior. It projected the geometric patterns of the windows onto the opposite walls, the columns, and the floor. For hours at a time, the cathedral's interior became a canvas for a moving artwork of light and shadow, where circles, trefoils, and quatrefoils danced slowly across the stone, making the abstract principles of sacred geometry tangibly visible to everyone inside. This interplay was never static. As the sun traveled from east to west, its beams would sequentially highlight different areas of the church, creating a rhythmic cycle of revelation and concealment. In the early morning, light might stream through an eastern apse window, setting the high altar ablaze and illuminating the crucifix, emphasizing the start of the liturgical day with the promise of resurrection. By noon, the sun, directly overhead, would pour through the clerestory windows high up in the nave walls, flooding the upper vaults with light and making the ribbed ceiling appear to float weightlessly, a vision of the heavenly realm. Later in the afternoon, the low-angle light would pour through the western windows, catching the dust motes in the air and stretching long, dramatic shadows down the nave's entire length, turning the space into a tunnel of gold and deepening gloom. This daily cycle echoed the rhythm of the monastic hours, marking the passage of time not with the ticking of a clock, but with the silent, majestic movement of divine light. The profound symbolism of this light show was rooted in a clear theological distinction. Medieval scholars differentiated between lux and lumen. Lux was ordinary, physical sunlight, the light of the natural world. But when that same light passed through the colored glass of a biblical narrative and was filtered by the sacred geometry of the tracery, it was transformed into lumen, spiritual, divine light, capable of illuminating the soul. The material stone of the cathedral represented the earthly, temporal world, solid and permanent. The dancing, colored light represented the immaterial, eternal Spirit of God. Their constant interaction within the sacred space taught a powerful lesson, that the divine was not separate from the world but was actively engaged with it, constantly playing across its surfaces, revealing hidden truths and transforming the mundane into the magnificent. This dynamic environment actively shaped the experience of worship. The ever-changing play of light and shadow discouraged a passive gaze and instead encouraged deep contemplation. A worshipper might fixate on a particular pool of ruby red light as it slowly traveled across the floor, each movement inviting meditation on the blood of Christ. The way a shadow could deepen the mystery of a sculpted saint's face one moment, and then have it burst into clarity the next mirrored the Christian understanding of God's presence, sometimes hidden and mysterious, sometimes overwhelmingly clear and immediate. The architecture itself became a guide for the soul, using the universal language of light to demonstrate that the divine was both the unchanging, constant source behind all things, like the fixed stone structure, and a living, dynamic presence that was new every morning, forever interacting with creation in fresh and unexpected ways, much like the mysterious, unchanging, yet ever applicable beauty of a mathematical truth. While the geometry of arches and vaults shaped the physical space, it was the silent language of numbers that encoded the deepest spiritual truths into the cathedral's very dimensions. For the medieval mind, certain numbers were not merely quantities, they were divine signifiers, sacred keys that unlocked the symbolic meaning of creation. This belief, known as numerology, was rooted in the ancient idea that God had constructed the universe as a rational, mathematical order, and that by studying number, humanity could glimpse the mind of the Creator. This wasn't a fringe or superstitious practice. It was a central pillar of a worldview where the material and spiritual were seamlessly intertwined. Every number held a specific theological weight, and the master builders wove this numerical scripture directly into the fabric of their stone sermons. The most potent numbers formed a holy arithmetic that any medieval Christian, from a learned theologian to a humble farmer, would instantly recognize. The number 3 stood as the preeminent symbol for the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, a single God in 3 distinct persons. This triune pattern is everywhere, in the triple division of a cathedral's west facade into 3 doorways, in the 3 levels of the interior elevation, arcade, triforium, clerestory, and in the trefoil, 3-lobed shapes that adorn window tracery and stone carvings. The number 4 represented the earthly realm, the solidity of the created world, the 4 cardinal directions, the 4 seasons, and the 4 elements. It also signified the 4 evangelists Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, whose Gospels were the 4 pillars of the Church's teaching. This is why the crossing, where the nave and transept intersect, almost always forms a perfect square, grounding the spiritual structure in the stability of the earthly and the evangelical. Then there were the numbers of completion and covenant. The number 7 held immense power as the number of divine perfection and completion, the 7 days of creation, the 7 sacraments of the Church, and the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. This is why you might find a chapel with 7 sides or a series of 7 arches leading to an altar. The number 12, representing the 12 apostles as the foundation of the New Jerusalem, was equally crucial. But the builders often used it in its squared form, 144. A nave measuring 144 feet long wasn't just a convenient length. It was a direct architectural quotation from the Book of Revelation, which describes the heavenly city with walls measuring 144 cubits. By building to this dimension, the Masons were asserting that their cathedral was an earthly echo of that celestial city, a tangible outpost of heaven. This integration of number was far from arbitrary or merely decorative. It was a deliberate act of embedding theology into measurable reality. The dimensions of the building became a catechism in stone, reinforcing doctrine for a largely illiterate population. A worshipper didn't need to read Latin to understand that walking past 7 piers on each side of the nave meant they were moving under the protection of the sacraments. They could feel the significance of the space without consciously knowing the math, absorbing its order and harmony on a subliminal level. The presence of these numbers offered a profound psychological and spiritual reassurance. In a world often filled with disease, famine, and violence, the cathedral stood as a colossal, immutable promise. Its numerical perfection was proof that behind the apparent chaos of daily life was a rational, benevolent, and orderly divine plan. The universe was not a random, frightening place. It was a cosmos, a beautifully ordered whole, and every person had a numbered, meaningful place within its grand design. Imagine walking from the dim, heavy silence of a Romanesque abbey into the soaring, luminous space of a Gothic cathedral. The difference is not merely one of style. It is a complete sensory and spiritual revolution, a fundamental shift in how humanity conceived its relationship with the divine, and it was all made possible by a breathtaking new mastery of geometry. The sturdy, earth-bound churches of the earlier period, with their massive walls and small, rounded windows, spoke of a fortress god, a distant, powerful protector to be approached with awe and perhaps a touch of fear. Their strength lay in sheer mass, in the immense weight of stone piled upon stone, creating a sense of protective enclosure, but also of profound separation from the world outside. The geometry was simple, robust, and defensive. The semicircle of the arch, the solid square of the pier, the cylinder of the column. These forms were powerful, but they ultimately limited the ambition of the builders, tethering the sacred space firmly to the ground. Then, in the 12th century, something extraordinary happened. A new generation of master masons, armed with insights from cross-cultural exchange and a deepening understanding of geometric principles, began to ask a radical question. What if a building's strength came not from the thickness of its walls, but from the precision of its angles? This was the genesis of the Gothic Revolution, a paradigm shift where architecture learned to leap toward the heavens. The key was the pointed arch. Unlike the rounded Romanesque arch, which pushes its weight outward and downward, requiring those massive walls to contain the thrust, the pointed arch channels its weight more directly downward. This simple geometric change was like a magic trick. It allowed for taller, narrower openings and greater heights without the need for walls as thick as a castle's. But the pointed arch was just the beginning of this geometric symphony. The true engineering marvel was the system of ribbed vaults. Instead of creating a solid, tunnel-like barrel vault, Gothic masons designed a skeletal framework of stone ribs at diagonals crossing each other to form a web of arches. These ribs carried the weight of the vault, channeling it down to specific points, the tops of slender columns. The spaces between the ribs, the webbing, could then be filled with much lighter stone. This was a move from solid mass to intelligent framework, from brute force to elegant efficiency. It was the architectural equivalent of replacing a solid block of wood with a beautifully crafted birdcage, incredibly strong for its weight, but mostly composed of air and light. And just as a birdcage needs external support to keep its delicate structure from collapsing, the Gothic cathedral found its final geometric genius in the flying buttress. These graceful, arched stone arms leapfrog through the air outside the building, connecting the upper walls of the nave to massive vertical piers. Their job is to catch the outward thrust from the vaults and channel it safely into the ground, acting like a set of stone gymnastics spotting the entire structure. With this exoskeleton in place, the interior walls WERE Chinese letter liberated. They were no longer load-bearing. They could become vast, fragile curtains of stained glass. This staggering technical achievement was driven by a profound theological transformation. The new religious orders of the time, particularly the Cistercians and the Franciscans, began to emphasize a more personal, accessible God, a God of light and love, rather than solely of judgment and power. The architecture became a physical manifestation of this new piety. The goal was no longer to create a protective fortress for the altar, but to dissolve the very barrier between heaven and earth. The new geometric toolkit allowed them to do just that. Those towering walls of glass transformed sunlight into lumen divine, spiritual light that flooded the interior, dissolving the stone in a kaleidoscope of color. The incredibly complex geometry of the window tracery, stars, roses, and intricate networks of circles was not just decoration. It was a representation of the complex, rational, and beautiful mind of God. To stand in a cathedral like Chartres or Amiens is to feel you are standing within a jewel, at the heart of a divine logic made visible. The building is no longer a barrier against the world, but a lens focusing heaven's light onto the community of believers below. This evolution from the solid, protective earthiness of the Romanesque to the luminous, aspirational geometry of the Gothic is one of history's most powerful examples of how a change in spirit can drive a revolution in form, and how a new way of thinking about God can literally reshape the skyline of an entire continent. If one building can be said to embody the entire mystical marriage of mathematics, faith, and stone that we've been exploring, it is undoubtedly the Cathedral of Chartres. Rising from the plains of France, it stands not merely as a place of worship, but as a consummate geometric manifesto, a perfect symphony of number, light, and form where every single element, from the grandest spire to the smallest carved detail, was meticulously calculated to create a unified, transcendent experience. To walk through Chartres is to walk through a living textbook of sacred geometry, where the abstract principles we've discussed are made breathtakingly tangible. The geometric journey begins before you even step inside with the magnificent west facade. Its proportions are a masterclass in the application of the golden ratio. If you were to take the height of the entire facade and divide it by the height from the base to the top of the royal portal doors, the result is approximately 1.618. This same divine proportion governs the relationship between the width of the entire facade and the width of the central door, and even the spacing of the towers and the placement of the great rose window. This isn't a coincidence, it's a deliberate compositional strategy that creates an immediate, subconscious sense of harmony and balance, drawing the eye upward in a feeling of natural, effortless ascent toward the heavens. Once you cross the threshold, the geometric precision only deepens. The floor plan is a near-perfect Latin cross, with the nave, transepts, and choir all adhering to strict proportional relationships. But the true geometric heart of the interior might be under your feet, the great labyrinth. Inlaid into the stone of the nave floor, this vast circular path is one of the few surviving medieval labyrinths of its size. Its design is a miracle of precision. The entire path is contained within a perfect circle, and the labyrinth itself is exactly the same width as the west rose window high above it on the opposite wall. Furthermore, the distance from the entrance of the cathedral to the center of the labyrinth is exactly equal to the height of the interior vaults. These are not arbitrary measurements, they are profound geometric statements, linking the horizontal journey of the pilgrim with the vertical aspiration of the architecture, grounding the celestial mathematics of the windows and vaults into the very path one walks. This dialogue between the macro and the micro continues in the cathedral's most famous feature, its stained glass. Chartres possesses the most complete and original collection of medieval stained glass in the world, and it is here that the concept of harmonic ratios becomes a visual theology. The windows are not just colored pictures, they are complex geometric compositions. The artists used a system of rhythmic proportions, often based on the same musical ratios that create harmony in sound, to organize their biblical narratives. A large panel might be divided using a 2:1 ratio an octave, while smaller scenes within it might follow a 3:2 ratio a fifth. This creates a visual rhythm that guides the viewer's eye through the story in a specific contemplative order, making the window not just something to be seen, but to be read and felt. Perhaps the most stunning demonstration of the builder's intent is the cathedral's relationship with the sun. Chartres is a colossal astronomical instrument designed to harness the light of the solstices. On the summer solstice, a specific shaft of sunlight enters through a particular window and strikes a single, precisely placed flagstone in the nave. Even more famously, the entire design of the south transept, with its 3 lancet windows and its own rose window, is orchestrated to capture the light of the setting sun around the time of the summer solstice, transforming that entire end of the church into a blazing wall of divine fire. This alignment shows that the geometry of Chartres was not just about static forms, but about capturing and choreographing the dynamic, life-giving light of the cosmos itself, turning the passage of time into a sacred performance. What makes Chartres the ultimate case study is how all these elements, the proportions of the facade, the perfection of the labyrinth, the harmonics of the glass, and the alignments with the sun are not separate feats but threads in a single, seamless tapestry. The same mathematical logic that determines the size of a window also determines the height of a column and the layout of the floor. This creates a phenomenal sense of cohesion. The space feels both immense and intimate, overwhelming yet perfectly ordered. You are not simply in a large building, you are inside a single, unified geometric thought, a physical manifestation of the medieval belief in a cosmos governed by a rational, beautiful, and knowable order. Chartres doesn't just use sacred geometry, it is sacred geometry offering a timeless, visceral experience of how number, when infused with intention, can truly shape stone into spirit. While the great cathedrals were designed to inspire the masses with their soaring vaults and public grandeur, a quieter, more intimate form of sacred geometry was being practiced behind the high walls of monasteries. Here, away from the bustling towns, the purpose of architecture shifted from evangelization to introspection, from inspiring awe to facilitating inner peace. The monastic world was a universe unto itself, a self-contained microcosm where every aspect of daily life, from prayer to labor to sleep, was structured around the pursuit of divine connection. In this environment, geometry became less about monumental spectacle and more about creating a framework for ordered contemplation, a physical manifestation of the rule of Saint Benedict that called for a life of balance, discipline, and prayer. The heart of any monastery was the cloister, a square or rectangular garth surrounded by covered walkways. This was not merely a courtyard, it was the architectural embodiment of the monastic ideal. The quadrangular plan was profoundly symbolic. The 4 sides represented the 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the foundational texts that guided the monastic life. Walking the continuous path around the square was a physical meditation on the unity and completeness of evangelical truth. It also mirrored the concept of the hortus conclusus, or the enclosed garden, a symbol of the Virgin Mary's purity and a reflection of the lost paradise of Eden, now reclaimed and protected within the monastery walls. This enclosed geometric form created a world set apart, a sanctuary of spiritual order insulated from the chaos and temptations of the outside world. Beneath the walkway's vaulted ceilings, the rhythm of life was marked by geometry and light. The repeating series of arches, supported by paired columns, created a hypnotic visual rhythm for the monks as they processed for the daily offices. The number of bays might correspond to a significant number, like the 12 months of the year or the 7 canonical hours of prayer, turning a simple stroll into a walking meditation on time and liturgy. The play of light was just as carefully considered as in a cathedral, but its effect was more subtle. As the sun moved across the sky, it would cast the shadows of the arcade's columns diagonally across the walkway, slowly marching along the wall like a silent, celestial sundial. A monk glancing up from his reading could tell the time by the position of these shadows, a constant, gentle reminder of the passage of the hours and the next call to prayer. This natural timekeeping embedded the divine order of the cosmos into the most mundane moments of the day. At the very center of the cloister lay its geometric and spiritual core, the garden. This was no informal patch of greenery. It was a living diagram of creation, meticulously laid out with geometric precision. Typically, it was divided into 4 quadrants by 2 perpendicular paths, evoking the 4 rivers that flowed out of Eden to water the world. This cruciform pattern wasn't just symbolic, it provided practical access for the monks to tend the beds. Within each quadrant, the planting beds themselves were often arranged in intricate geometric patterns, concentric circles, spirals, or complex knots using low hedges of boxwood or fragrant herbs like lavender and thyme. The plants chosen were themselves symbolic: roses for the Virgin Mary, lilies for purity, and herbs for the healing virtues of Christ. This garden was a multi-sensory scripture. A monk could meditate on the order of creation by sight, smell the fragrance of sanctity, and taste the literal fruits of his labor, all within a perfectly ordered geometric frame. This harmonious blend of the symbolic and the practical extended to the entire monastery complex. The buildings were arranged around the cloister according to a precise plan that reflected the hierarchy of monastic activities. The church, the house of God, occupied the northern side, the position of greatest honor. The chapter house, where the community met for business and instruction, was off the eastern walkway, facing the rising sun of enlightenment. The refectory, or dining hall, was on the southern side for warmth and light, while the dormitory was often on the western side. This layout wasn't arbitrary. It was a 3-dimensional model of a well-ordered soul and community, where every function had its proper place, just as every virtue had its role in a spiritual life. The geometry of the monastery was a daily, lived experience of stability, a physical promise that a life ordered by divine principles could indeed create a foretaste of heaven on earth. Though the great age of cathedral building may have passed, the language of sacred geometry was never forgotten. It simply found new dialects in which to speak. The same principles that guided the master mason's hand, the pursuit of harmony, the resonance with natural forms, the infusion of space with meaning, continue to inform and inspire architects and artists today, proving that this ancient wisdom is far more than a historical relic. It is a living tradition, constantly being rediscovered and reinterpreted to create spaces that serve the human spirit in a modern context. You can see its legacy not in literal copies of Gothic spires, but in the underlying DNA of designs that feel inherently balanced, uplifting, and right. Consider the work of architects like Le Corbusier, a pioneer of modernism who developed a system of proportional design called the modular. This was essentially a rediscovery of the golden ratio, a scale of harmonic measurements based on the human form, intended to bring a universal beauty to everything from door handles to entire apartment blocks. Frank Lloyd Wright's Fallingwater is another masterclass in this principle. The house doesn't just sit in the landscape, it emerges from it, its cantilevered concrete terraces echoing the natural ledges of the rock face and unfolding in a series of horizontal layers that resonate with the same rhythmic progression found in a Fibonacci sequence. The goal is the same as it was at Chartres: to create a structure that feels like a natural extension of the ordered universe, a place where the inhabitants feel subconsciously at peace because the geometry of the space aligns with the geometry of life itself. This pursuit extends far beyond individual buildings to the very planning of our communities. the growing movement of new urbanism and sustainable design often looks to sacred geometry for creating neighborhoods that foster connection and well-being. Instead of the chaotic, car-centric sprawl of many modern suburbs, these communities might be organized around a central green space, a modern version of the cloister Goth, with radiating streets that encourage walking and a sense of shared identity. The use of circular layouts, public squares, and pedestrian-friendly pathways all harken back to the idea that the design of our environment can either promote social cohesion and personal tranquility or breed isolation and anxiety. We are slowly relearning what medieval builders knew intuitively, that a city is not just a collection of structures, but a living organism that thrives when its parts are in harmonious relation to one another and to the whole. The influence is perhaps most vividly apparent in the spaces we build for art, music, and contemplation. Modern concert halls, like the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles, are designed with painstaking attention to acoustic geometry. The angles of the walls, the curves of the balconies, and the shape of the ceiling are all calculated using principles of wave interference and sound reflection that are the direct descendants of the harmonic ratios studied in the quadrivium. The goal is to create a sweet spot for every member of the audience, where the music arrives with perfect clarity and richness, enveloping them in an immersive experience that is as close to the medieval ideal of the music of the spheres as modern science can achieve. Similarly, many modern meditation labyrinths, built in parks and retreat centers, offer the same geometric path for reflection that was walked at Chartres, providing a non-denominational tool for mindfulness and inner journeying that is as effective today as it was 800 years ago. Even in the seemingly cold digital realm, the patterns of sacred geometry are experiencing a renaissance. Digital artists and generative designers use algorithms to create intricate, infinitely complex fractal patterns forms that repeat at different scales, revealing a hidden order within apparent chaos. These mesmerizing digital mandalas, which can be zoomed into forever, are the modern equivalent of the Islamic arabesque or the radiating tracery of a rose window. They tap into that same deep human fascination with infinite regression and cosmic pattern, proving that the desire to find order and meaning through geometry is not dependent on stone and mortar, but is a fundamental part of how we perceive and create beauty, whether with a compass or a computer. This enduring legacy shows us that sacred geometry is not about a specific style or a set of dogmatic rules. It is about a perennial human impulse, the drive to create spaces and objects that resonate with a deeper order, that connect us to something larger than ourselves, and that satisfy our innate craving for both intellectual structure and spiritual wonder. The medieval cathedrals stand as the ultimate testament to this impulse, but their true lesson is that the quest didn't end with them. It continues every time an architect chooses a proportion because it feels harmonious, every time a city planner designs a park to be the heart of a community, and every time we arrange our own homes to be sanctuaries of peace and light. The ancient language of shape and number is still being spoken all around us, waiting for those with eyes to see and ears to hear its timeless, harmonious song. Of course, the profound beauty and mathematical precision of sacred geometry can sometimes lead us down paths of wild speculation, where history ends and fantasy begins. In our modern era, these ancient principles have often been swept up by fringe theories that paint a picture of secret societies, lost alien civilizations, and magical codes hidden in plain sight. You might have heard claims that the layouts of cathedrals are maps to hidden treasure, or that the geometric patterns are actually ancient star charts left by extraterrestrial visitors. These narratives are certainly compelling. They tap into our love for a good mystery, but they fundamentally misunderstand the true nature of this historical practice. They project a modern desire for occult secrecy onto a tradition that was, for its time, remarkably open, scholarly, and grounded in a widely accepted view of the universe. The myth of exaggerated secrecy around the Mason guilds is a perfect example. While it's true that these guilds protected their trade secrets to maintain their livelihood and standards, this was primarily a form of intellectual property protection, not the guarding of esoteric, magical knowledge. Think of it like a modern tech company protecting its proprietary software code. The master mason's geometric knowledge, how to derive the golden ratio from a square, how to lay out a complex vault pattern, was the core of his professional value. Sharing it freely would have put him out of a job. The initiation rituals and oaths of these guilds were about fostering a sense of brotherhood, ensuring quality control, and protecting the economic viability of their craft. They were not about concealing a hidden cosmic truth from the masses. They were about ensuring that the apprentice who learned these valuable skills was trustworthy and committed to the high standards of the community. Another common misinterpretation is labeling these practices as occult. This word carries heavy baggage today, implying a dark, hidden, and potentially sinister knowledge reserved for the few. But in the medieval context, this is a profound misreading. The word occult simply means hidden, and in that sense, yes, the geometric principles underlying creation were believed to be hidden within nature, waiting to be discovered by the rational mind. However, this knowledge was not seen as forbidden or dark. It was considered the highest form of science and theology, a way to understand the mind of God through his creation. The symbolism was intentional and powerful, but it was the shared language of the entire culture, preached from pulpits and taught in schools. The geometric patterns in a cathedral were not a secret code for initiates. They were a public billboard of belief, designed to be read and understood by everyone, from the illiterate peasant to the educated cleric, each at their own level. Separating these modern myths from the historical reality is not about stripping away the wonder. It's about replacing a shallow mystery with a much deeper, more human admiration. When we dismiss these achievements as the work of aliens or attribute them to magical powers, we ironically rob the medieval builders of the credit they so richly deserve. It is far more astounding to understand that human beings using nothing but ropes, compasses, wooden templates, and their own profound intellect achieved these wonders through observation, calculation, and painstaking craft. Their ingenuity was not supernatural. It was a testament to the incredible heights that human reason, faith, and collaborative effort can reach when focused on a unified goal. This clarity allows us to engage with these monuments honestly. We can stand in Chartres Cathedral and appreciate it not as a puzzle box of conspiracy, but as a breathtaking cultural achievement. It is the product of a society that believed the universe was knowable, beautiful, and good, and that humanity had a role to play in celebrating that order through creative work. By letting go of the distorted myths, we can truly honor the medieval mind not as possessors of a lost magical secret, but as brilliant, practical, and inspired artists and engineers who left us a permanent record of their quest for harmony, a quest that continues to resonate with anyone who ever looked up at the stars and felt a desire to understand their pattern. So how do we translate this ancient wisdom, this language of cosmic harmony, into the concrete reality of our own 21st century lives? The beautiful truth is that you don't need to be a master mason or even own a compass to begin weaving the principles of sacred geometry into your daily existence. This isn't about recreating a Gothic cathedral in your backyard. It's about learning the underlying grammar of harmony and using it to compose spaces and experiences that resonate with our deepest need for balance, peace, and connection. It's an invitation to move from being passive inhabitants of our environments to becoming conscious co-creators of them, shaping our surroundings to nurture our well-being. Consider the simple act of arranging a room. Most of us default to pushing furniture up against the walls, but what if we thought more like a medieval architect? Applying the golden ratio can be as straightforward as positioning your most important piece of furniture, a sofa, a bed, a desk, so that it divides the room into sections that roughly approximate that divine proportion of 1 to 1.618. This isn't a rigid rule, but a guiding principle that often results in a layout that simply feels more balanced and inviting. You can extend this thinking to the art on your walls. Instead of hanging a single small picture in the center of a vast wall, consider creating a grouping where the overall dimensions of the arrangement relate harmoniously to the size of the wall itself. These subtle adjustments might not be consciously noticed by your guests, but they work on a subliminal level to create an atmosphere of inherent rightness and calm, turning a house into a sanctuary. For those with a patch of earth to tend, the garden offers a magnificent canvas for living geometry. Instead of straight, utilitarian rows, why not design based on nature's own patterns? A mandala garden, laid out in concentric circles divided into wedge-shaped beds, is not only a stunning visual feature, but also a highly efficient way to organize companion planting and maximize space. You could create a small, personal labyrinth for walking meditation using stones or low-growing herbs, providing a dedicated path for contemplation and mental decluttering right outside your door. Even planting in spirals or incorporating raised beds in geometric shapes connects your gardening practice to an ancient tradition of seeing the cultivated land as a mirror of the ordered cosmos, a place where human intention collaborates with natural growth. The influence of these principles extends powerfully into the creative arts. A photographer might use the golden spiral to compose a shot, consciously placing the focal point where the eye is naturally drawn to travel through the image. A graphic designer uses these same ratios to create logos and layouts that are visually pleasing and instantly memorable. Musicians understand that the intervals we find most harmonious are mathematical relationships between sound wave frequencies. When we consciously apply these patterns, we are quite literally tuning our creations to a universal frequency of beauty. It's a way to move beyond arbitrary choices and anchor our work in a timeless foundation of aesthetic truth. Perhaps the most profound modern application is in the design of our shared spaces, our communities, workplaces, and healing centers. Forward-thinking architects and urban planners are increasingly looking to sacred geometry to combat the alienating effects of much modern design. The goal is to create environments that don't just house people, but that actively promote their psychological and social well-being. A hospital might incorporate calming, fractal patterns in its flooring, or use proportions known to reduce stress in room design. A public library could be arranged with a central, circular atrium that acts as a community hearth, with radiating wings creating a sense of both unity and quiet separation. This is where sacred geometry moves from a personal practice to a social one, fostering communities that feel integrated, harmonious, and human-scaled. It reminds us that design is never neutral. It either supports our humanity or diminishes it. By choosing to learn from the past, we can build a future where our spaces don't just shelter us, but truly uplift us, proving that the quest for harmony is not a historical artifact, but a living, breathing necessity for the human spirit. From the precise ground plans of cathedrals to the very social structures they physically upheld, sacred geometry served as the silent, all-pervasive architect of the entire medieval worldview. It represented a breathtakingly cohesive vision of the cosmos, one that seamlessly blended faith, science, and art into a unified whole. This was a philosophy that saw no conflict between the rationality of mathematics and the mystery of the divine. Instead, it understood them as two different languages describing the same magnificent, ordered reality. It taught that the universe was fundamentally rational and knowable, yet infinitely mysterious in its depth, and that humanity held a unique and glorious role to participate in divine creativity through disciplined, reverent craft. The cathedral was not just a building, it was the ultimate expression of this belief, a collective project where thousands of hands, guided by geometric truth, worked together to bring a glimpse of heaven down to earth. As we stand today and look back across the centuries at these monumental achievements, we are offered a powerful reminder: the human quest to find meaning through pattern and proportion, to create harmony from chaos, and to build structures that reflect our highest aspirations is utterly timeless. It did not end when the last Gothic spire was completed. This same impulse drives the modern architect designing a hospital that promotes healing through natural light and calming proportions. It guides the artist composing a painting using the golden ratio, the musician writing a symphony based on harmonic intervals, and the city planner laying out a community park to foster connection and peace. We are all, in our own ways, continuing the work of those master masons, using the principles of order and beauty to shape a world that nurtures the human spirit. So let the silent lessons of the cathedral inspire you. Look for these patterns in your own world. Notice how the spiral of a seashell echoes the curve of a galaxy. Consider how the layout of a room can make you feel either anxious or at peace. Perhaps even experiment with arranging your own space to feel more balanced, or take a mindful walk through a local labyrinth. This isn't about replicating the past, but about reconnecting with a universal language of harmony that is just as relevant today as it was 800 years ago. We are all innately wired to respond to this language because we are, ourselves, part of its living pattern. We'd love to hear how this resonates with you. Share your own thoughts in the comments below on how geometry shapes your perception of the spaces you inhabit and the spirit